Mingalaba! Welcome to the Webishop 2022 series on nurturing ourselves as peace builders. The United Board organized these virtual workshops or Webishops in response to Myanmar educators' request for more tools in peace education. They have realized that doing whole person education also means being agents of peace in their classrooms and communities. Each video has been edited for brevity and is made available for educators who wish to integrate peace education in their teaching. Once again, welcome.
Today is a little bit introspective. So I want to ask us just for about 30 seconds to just really come into this space. I know that your lives draw you in many different directions. I know many of you are sick of being on a Zoom call. I know that there are many stresses and strains. So let's, for a minute, you can put your hands together, you can put your hands open, you can put your hands on your heart. Let's just spend 30 seconds being very silent together, but also making your brain come here. Let's try and become very present, because when you're very present today, I think you will get more from this session. It's a bit different to the other sessions. So let's just for 30 seconds, be really conscious that we are in a room together. We are with one another. So let's just 30 seconds be connected to one another. Take a big breath. This particular book is called The Moral Imagination. And we're going today to dig a little bit deeper into this book. It's by one of the founders or significant thinkers in the field of peace building, John Paul Lederach. And I didn't send you the whole book. I just sent you the best summary that I know of that book. So if you didn't get a chance to read it, you can still read it this week. But let me try and pull out some of the key elements. We already looked at the framework for conflict transformation, but let's look now at the art and the soul of peace building. Because what we know about peace building is it's more than a technical skill. It takes a lot of emotion. It takes a lot of your own self to come into the possibility to be able to do it. I think last week we heard about the example of the classroom where you are facing NLD and USDP people together in conflict. And it takes a lot of your own energy and your own self to be able to manage those dynamics in your classroom. So this is really about that journey. What is the moral imagination? The moral imagination is this possibility that we go down a journey, a pathway together. And we have to look at different turns and different possibilities along the way. It is about imagining something that doesn't exist yet. In the last year and a half in Myanmar, it's been very hard to imagine what comes out of this that's positive. How do we see the future? How do we imagine a new Myanmar? In peace building, we call that peace building in the midst of crisis. And actually, this project and all of you are already imagining a possibility beyond your current reality. You are doing a training and workshops, preparing your thinking about what kind of curriculums can you have that builds peace? What kind of relationships do you have with each other and your students? What kind of education system might Myanmar have in the future after we've passed through this violent period? I think we've talked in the last couple of weeks too about groups like NUG, NUCC, different ethnic leaders, different civil society leaders, Generation Z, young people, all kinds of people are trying to imagine their way through this crisis. And so the moral imagination is, how do we start to think about the beautiful future that we want and that we start to build it from now? So it's like going down a path, and that path might not be straight. Certainly in Myanmar, it's not straight. It goes this way and that way. There are different points which turn in one way, possibilities along the way, and we have to keep seizing them and holding that vision. Do you remember in the framework we did of the big vision that's coming? We have to have a vision of the future. And many of you talked about that. How do we have a vision in the midst of these difficult times? So this is what the imagination is about, is how do we look into the future? And there are a few ways to think about that. One, in peace building, we know that constructive change doesn't come from techniques or strategies only. So it's not something you can read in a book. Building peace has frameworks. We looked at some of them, but that's not the only thing that will bring about peace. It's also an ability to be an artist, to be creative, to be able to facilitate people together. It's about imagining what we can't already see, just like artists do, just like holy people do, is that they can imagine something beyond the reality that we're in. And that's the challenge of doing a workshop or a training on peace building, is because not all peace building has a formula. It is a science, but it's not only a science. We also have to bring our heart and soul to this work. One of the things that John Paul says in his book is that transcending violence is advanced or strengthened or made possible by the capacity to generate, mobilize, and build this moral imagination. So that means that we don't just address violence. We don't just put a Band-Aid on violence. Actually, what we need to do is keep building our capacities to imagine something else, to mobilize together. We talked a bit about those people that had mobilized in the CDM and those that have also mobilized in their own ways. How do you bring that together creatively, generatively, to make something new come out of this? It's like giving birth to a new possibility in the midst of the ashes. He says there are 4 ways to do that. One is to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships, which even includes our enemies. So actually, I was so happy to hear Nui speaking last week about her classroom. Is in her classroom exists a whole lot of relationships between students, some of which are USDP, some of which are NLD, some of which are non-political, I'm sure. And they exist in this classroom together with her, with other students, with their families, a kind of web of relationships that includes those that they hate, those that are their opposition. So when we imagine a future, we don't just imagine a future for ourselves. We also imagine a future for our enemies, for those who are in the military, that those who are doing violence. We imagine what kind of future can we give them? How can we change them? Or how can we correct the injustices that they have done? Second, on the other side here, we talk about the ability to embrace complexity. This one is very challenging, but in Myanmar, you are very good at this, because actually there is no black and white. There are many, many, many stakeholders, many of them behaving who might be considered good political stakeholders, also doing some very challenging and difficult things. There are stakeholders who are using violence even in the name of good. There are different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different business people, different international stakeholders. It is very complicated, very complex story. So we have to be willing in our building of peace to embrace, to be accepting of complications, complexity. In this corner down here, it talks about our commitment to being creative. So I'm always sorry for AA because I like to pick on her. But today she showed exactly that commitment. She said, I don't feel good today, but I'm putting on my lipstick and I'm showing up and I'm committing to being creative today. So even the act of putting on lipstick, I also put on my lipstick, but that is an indication of, even in the darkest days, we try to find something that sparks our creativity, that gives us some energy, that continues to drive us to other possibilities. And the last in this corner down here is that we accept that there is a risk that goes with our efforts to transcend violence. So the last couple of weeks, we've talked about the terrible violence that you are facing, state violence, between groups, on individuals. I don't need to remind you of the violence that you've been experiencing. And so actually the work of people who work on peace is very risky. It's not just risky to your person, it's risky to your soul, because it takes a lot. You're giving yourself all of the time. You are always showing up and showing others how to be different. Last week we saw how it's about challenging perceptions and narratives. That takes a lot from inside of you. So there's a big risk to you, the person, physically, emotionally, intellectually. Some of you know the risk that you have had to take in order to stand by your own values and principles. It's huge risks that you have all been taking. So we have to imagine the relationships, embrace the complexity, commit to being creative, and accepting all the risks that this takes. I'll give you a couple more of these and then we're going to have a chance to process them. In the past years in Myanmar, when we talked about peace, and let me say specifically from 2011 and 12, when President Thein Sein announced there was going to be a big peace process, and we were all very excited, and we all came together, and we saw international community arriving, and we saw a lot of peace talks and peace agreements and ceasefire agreements, many things. We were all very excited. It's coming, the peace is coming. But actually, when we look back, we can say that a lot of those peace agreements didn't equal real social change in Myanmar. That one of the reasons that we're in this situation today is that although 10 years ago, the military did make some changes, they didn't really bring the change that would bring more social equity, that would take the military out of the system we talked about in the first week. So what this framework that John Paul is speaking about is saying, please be careful not to want too much the peace agreement versus the real change. So I put some examples here of peace agreements. When people sign peace agreements, very often on the stage, I think you can see usually a lot of men. You can see the peace agreement with Taliban, with Israel, with Colombia, there's a peace agreement in South Sudan, South Africa. But what we can see in almost all of these cases is that although there was a beautiful document that said, we are having peace, we agree to stop fighting, but actually these documents didn't bring the real social change. And I think this is very critical for your students, is these days in international relations, people teach a lot about the peace agreements. This peace talks, the UN is coming. We've talked about the young people who called for responsibility to protect. Please, UN, come and protect us, come and protect us. But actually, the real change that Myanmar people, when I listen to you, you're hungry for is a really significant change in the way that you live together. Social equity, no military in the parliament, a constitution that recognizes the ethnic rights, a citizenship that recognizes all people, right to all religions, right to ethnic languages, many things you want to change. So one document like an NCA, a National Ceasefire Agreement, will not change everything in Myanmar you want. And so this is why peace building is more than peace talks. Peace building is changing the whole society, not just signing the paper to say we stop fighting each other. So if I'm honest, when I look back on the last 10 years, I can say in a way, people were really tricked. People were tricked to think that there was peace coming, that we were in peace, that peace was part of all of this money and energy that was spent. But actually that change wasn't based on a real change that was really for the people. So what John Paul's talking about is, yes, inner self, political, we have to be careful of the political processes, but we also have to look after ourselves. And what he says is that peace builders in the movement or the massive work that has to be done for peace, we are like yeast. So yeast, when you make bread, is the smallest ingredient. It's the least of the things. You have flour, you have water, but yeast is what helps the bread to rise up. And so what we say is that just a small number of people is enough to help bring around social change or peace building. It doesn't have to be everybody, but ideally, even one teacher in one classroom can help the students think, okay, how can we think differently? How can we see each other? How significant it is that as a teacher, you can be facilitating conversations about the future of the country, helping people listen to each other. One teacher can help change the thinking of 10 students, 15 students, 100 students. That's very powerful for each of you. Second is that if you leave the yeast out of the bread, if you don't mix it in, then there's no growth in the bread. It doesn't rise up. So very importantly, that each of you, if you're serious to go on this pathway to peace, is to embrace mixing with people, not just the people that think like you, but people who think differently to you. We call that like mixing in the larger mass of people. So in your classrooms, you come into contact with all kinds of people. That's very challenging and very brave of what you do. But actually, that's part of your job as educators, but also peace educators, is that you are mixing with all kinds of people, all kinds of dynamics. The other thing about yeast is that you have to mix it in slowly, and it has to cultivate. So actually, You have to be able to bring people slowly with you. You can't just go into your classroom tomorrow and force everybody to change. You have to be with people, accompany people, keep talking with people, listening to people. So social change doesn't happen overnight. You have to make the space safe for people. That's what Noe was saying, is when she talked to her students, there was a big clash. So now we have to calm down the clash and help find a way, a safe way for their students to feel that they can talk and listen to each other. You have to mix the yeast really in. And if you've ever made bread, you have to really knead it with your hands, really hold it, push it, manipulate it, knead it is how they frame it. So actually, we also have to be having that ability to keep showing up, to keep trying to find ways to look for the pathway into the future. And last but not least, when you make bread, you have to preheat the oven. You can't just put bread in a cold oven and then heat it. You have to make it hot first. And I want to dare to say that you are right in a hot oven right now in Myanmar. And this is a very critical moment for you to be having these conversations, to be talking to people about what do you want? What kind of future are we building? How are we coming together? There are many reasons in Myanmar to be divided, but actually right in the middle of the most hot conflict in Asia at the moment, you have a chance to build, to bake some new bread, to imagine what else is possible, because you are at the front line of building a new nation and building a new society and building a new possibility. There are some days it doesn't feel like it. But when we listen carefully to what's happening in Myanmar right now, you can hear young people are imagining new possibilities. People are saying, we want a different type of society. We won't accept this kind of government anymore. So actually, this is a chance for you to be this kind of yeast. It's a very funny image, I know. So the question for all of you is your yeast still alive? That's a funny question. But the question is really about you yourself in this moment of our training. How do you feel? Are you this yeast, this small ingredient that can help build more bread? Are you imagining a new possibility? Do you see the relationships around you? Are you willing to deal with all of this complexity and overwhelming things? It's a very personal question. I just want to share with you a couple more thoughts from this particular way of thinking. One is, firstly, how do we do this? So today we started this morning with stillness. We were very calm. We came together not just because we're in the same Zoom, but we came together in our energy. So actually, the first point here is about moving past the noise. What is noise? Noise is all of this Facebook posts telling you think like that, think like this, different narratives, different propagandas that we hear over our lives. Actually, we want to move past that. And we want to be still, and we want to be authentically listening to people in dialogue. So that means when you're with your students, really listening hard. What are they saying? What are they expressing? What is this generation wanting to tell us? That requires a lot of patience, a lot of humility. That's very challenging for all of us as humans. And one of the biggest obstacles in conflict is actually our ego, is our desire to be the one, to be powerful. And I think you can see that in the conflict right now in Myanmar, is there's a lot of ego. Who is going to be the president? Who is going to be the powerful one? Who will be in charge? Who gets the credit? Da, 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 da. So peace building comes from this place of humility, of patience, of stillness, And actually, that's what I can see in this room is actually very powerful, authentic people who are in touch with those parts of yourself. The second is to understand about time. And we talked about this a little bit last week when we looked at the framework. We have to understand that the past, the present, and the future are always now. Is what we can imagine for the future is happening now. What we know about the past doesn't really exist anymore. And we can't forget it. We can't get rid of it. But at the same time, we can change how we think about it now. This was something we were all taught by the old Tatmadaw before, 135 ethnic groups. So they used to say, there's 135 ethnic groups. So this country is very hard to govern. So we have to control it. But actually, yes, there are 135, there are more, there are less. Nobody can count. Actually, in Myanmar, you have so much diversity. But you are one people in very different ways, different languages, different religions, but you're still one people. You share territory, you share a history. So we can't put aside those narratives and stories from the past, but we can reinvent them into the future. So time is a very strange thing because it's something we invented. We put on a clock, we put on a calendar, but the only real time is right now. And we are in, like you said, this fire right now. What do we do with that? How do we shape right now into something we want to be in the future? So actually what Gandhi always said is be the change you want to see. If you want a different Myanmar in the future, you have to behave like that Myanmar now. You can't wait until Myanmar changes and then you become something different. You have to be that different now. That's very complicated about time, past, present, and future. And the last one, I really want you to think about this. And some of you have been saying this. You have been saying that actually the danger that you face in this fire right now is very strong ideology. When you say all ethnic groups, that's very dangerous because not all ethnic groups think the same. And not all ethnic people think the same. And not all ethnic political parties think the same. So we have to be very careful about our language and the way we talk about each other. Isolation. So actually some of you said that the more we don't interact with each other in the web of relationships, the further apart we become. So even in our own families, we know that different people in our family think like this is different to each other, but we have to stay together. So we require interdependence, actually. We're afraid. There is a lot of fear in Myanmar right now. People are afraid to say what they think. People are afraid to express something. There's a lot of control and domination. But that we have to keep working on staying together, not being pulled apart. This is a very critical part of this. The web of relationship, we need each other, actually. The other danger is to fall into this mentality that says them and us. We are like this, they are like that. Because that means that already we cut off the communication. We cut off the ability for them to change, us to change, for there to be complexity in the conversation. So we have to embrace this complexity. Is not everybody is monolithic. I used to say this before many years ago, 20 years ago, we used to say about Tatmadaw. Tatmadaw is not monolithic. There are some people in Tatmadaw who are very angry about violence, about injustice. There are other Tatmadaw not like that. Same with ethnic people. Some ethnic people, they don't want to use a violence. Some ethnic people are questioning their leaders about their use of resources. So no one group is purely the same. The NLD is not all the same. There are many different political perspectives in NLD. Even in the Central Executive Committee of the NLD, they are often arguing different sides of things. So we have to understand that nothing is monolithic. We cannot say them and us. We have to keep engaged with the complexity. And then we have to trust creativity. That's a very weird thing to think. Trust creativity is, today, one of you said, we teach chemistry. Dr. Nui, she said, we teach chemistry, but we want to try something different. For sure, when you try something different, even in your own classroom, you will see something change. People will change. The dynamics will change. The thinking will change. So it's always in your reach. You can always touch the possibility to make constructive change. It's not something far away in government. It's not something far away that happens in China or Russia, or it happens in your classroom. It's in your reach. Not all of us can be international UN envoy or this one or that one trying to solve Myanmar problem. But every single one of you has in your reach the possibility to help change the thinking of people. And last but not least, we have to accept our own vulnerability, our own weaknesses, our own fear. Because if we understand that we are afraid, we are nervous, we are scared, we don't know how the future looks, then we also know how our students feel. We know how our families are feeling. We know how our friends are feeling. We know how community is feeling. Everybody feels afraid. Everybody. Even Ming Online, even Aung San Suu Kyi, everybody feels afraid. If we can accept that we are all afraid, then we have a way to come together. And that help us to be closer to each other, to not be pushed apart, to be remote from one another. I also want to say that we will send you the PowerPoint from today, so you can also look at it more deeply. And we will also send you some new reading for next week, because we will do something a little bit different again next week. We'll look at the building blocks for peace and how we will make peace happen. So bless you all.